Hello everybody and welcome back to ChessDiagnostic. So I'm going to cover a game that was just played today between Carlsen and Firouzja, and actually it fits perfectly with what I've been talking about in the past couple days videos. And it's basically Carlsen sacrifices material for activity and Firouzja can't solve the defensive tasks that Carlsen presented him, and he ends up with a pretty quick win. And it also follows a similar opening that I covered in the Rajabov vs. Gujarati game. So this was in TATA Steel 2021. Carlsen's white, and it starts with d4, knight to f6, c4, and then after e6, we see what's actually called the e10 Indian game, the anti-Nimzo Indian, with knight to f3. So we see d5, which goes to a queen's gambit declined, the three knights for a little bit, and then after the knight develops, we see the barman variation. All right, so bishop to g5, h6, bishop goes back, and then after takes, knight takes, Carlsen takes the bishop and then plays e4, and after knight takes and c takes, or b takes c3, then Carlsen gets this huge center, and now he has something to worry about because Firouzja is going to start attacking it. Some more developing moves, bishop to d3, and then we see c5, a very typical move to undermine a huge center. All right, so takes, and now Carlsen has a very nice looking center, but of course black's going to get some dynamic play with b6 and then developing the bishop on the flank. All right, so Carlsen goes for a4 to a5 just to activate the rook and create some weaknesses on the queen's side. Knight to f6, hitting the e4 pawn. Carlsen defends it. And now rook from f to d8. Obviously trying to put pressure on the center even more on this d4 pawn. And Carlsen sidesteps kind of the pin and the pressure against the queen with queen to a1, protecting d4 as well as hitting a7. So Firouzja goes queen to c7, and actually Carlsen, he could take this pawn, but that would be an incorrect decision. He plays h3, just giving some room for the king and also preventing any back rank threats. Now let's see if the rook took here, then you would see something like this, and now with rook to a8, it would force a queen trade, and then with these weak pawns and rook to c8, then actually it would be black. Although it's completely equal, it would be black who gets his material back with some more activity and an equal endgame. So Carlsen doesn't go for that. Instead, we see h3 and then just protecting the pawn. Now with rook to c5, I really like this game because Carlsen just makes very simple threats, and you know, sometimes you don't have to have some overarching strategy. He's just increasing his piece activity, making simple threats, and you would be surprised how if you just attack and make simple threats, a lot of opponents, even Firouzja, you know, world top 10 or top 20, kind of cracks under the pressure that Carlsen presents in this game. So after rook to c5, we see Firouzja trying to increase his own activity and of course, threatening the e4 pawn. And Carlsen plays rook to e5. Now it looks like he's just protecting the e4 pawn, but it's also kind of a sinister threat, reducing the queen's activity. And the threat, for example, let's say black plays something like rook to d7, then actually black loses his queen, because after g3, the queen has to take the knight, but then rook to e3, and there's no squares for the queen. All right, so let's not get bogged down in variations. I'm just trying to give some lessons here on simple threats and piece activity, which Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, gives here. Now, I really like this game because it's not a perfect game. There's some advantage that goes to black, but actually, because of the piece activity and the simple threats, you can see that the defense in those situations is not so simple. So instead, Firouzja attacks the rook on e5, and Carlsen just gets the rook out of the danger zone. He brings the knight back. And now Carlsen actually comes up with what I call an activity sacrifice. So he plays d5, pawn takes, and now e5. Now notice, because he took the pawn on d5, now the bishop, the activity is reduced. And this is how you can evaluate these kind of sacrifices. Now with e5, of course, the knight can come forward, but now Carlsen centralizes his queen with queen to d4. Now look at these rooks and this bishop. He just reduced the activity, so of course you're not going to always know if it works out for you, but you can easily evaluate these kind of situations by seeing if it closes off, or if a pawn closes off the bishop line or a rook line. And that actually kind of, there was a defense I talked about in the Rajabov game yesterday with bishop to g3. All right, so let's stick to this game. Firouzja tries to increase his activity on the c file, and Carlsen, he wants to keep all of his pieces active, so he goes rook to a1, and he's going to reroute the rook to the b file, which he does right away, hits the bishop, and now actually the rook is ready to come in to b6 as well. We see more pawn sacrifices to increase his own activity, and this is a good education on pawn play by Carlsen. Now, some people will say that pawns are the soul of chess, but actually pieces are, because pawns, they can reduce your activity of your pieces by getting in their way. And so sometimes it is better to just give away a pawn and just let your lines and your files open for your pieces, which is what we see here. Pawn takes, and now immediately the knight can occupy the e5 square. The queen goes back to pin that e5 knight. Of course, he could take here, but that would just give away any advantage. And actually, objectively, according to the computer, it's black who has a slight edge, probably because of the material. Carlsen chases that knight back, and then he brings in the rook. Now, let's just take a second to look at this activity. We have all the pieces of white are very, very active and centralized, and we have this somewhat awkward situation of these two rooks and the bishop not really doing much for black. So the bishop goes back because it was attacked twice, and then Carlsen reduces the pin, and now black actually has a 1.5 advantage. And it's somewhat hard to figure out exactly what to do here. So it looks like black could play h5. I'm just looking at the computer lines. This game just came out. And then if he played f4, then actually black would just go back to e4, either forcing white to take, giving the pawn back, but now he has this passed pawn on the a file. But of course, these kind of defenses are sometimes hard to find. All right, so we see a4. Firouzja has the correct idea, just pushing the pawn, hitting the queen. The queen goes back. And now we see Carlsen prioritizing activity over material with rook takes e6. Now, actually, a better defense here would be a3, just pushing the pawn and ignoring. And then we could see rook to e7, and then queen to d6, preventing queen to e5, threatening checkmate. And actually, it would be black who would be almost winning here because of this passed a pawn, and it's actually quite hard for white now to suddenly come in. All right, so if he does bishop to f5, then just rook to d8 or even d4, hitting back in the center. But of course, you know, it looks simple when you look at it with the computer now, but we can see that even Firouzja got bamboozled in this position. He took, and now the last fatal mistake is bishop to f7. The simple king to h8, and then if he goes queen to f5 here, then after check goes over, then black should actually give some material back, and then he trades, and you can see that black would actually retain an advantage with these passed pawns here. So he should have went for that defense, but of course with bishop to f7. Now the reason bishop to f7 is a mistake is because it actually cuts off the rook and the queen from protecting the king side. So let's see what happens here. We see knight takes, and now it's white who's suddenly winning very quickly after the queen goes to c7. Would have been a little more difficult if he played rook to c7, but for example, if he plays rook to c7, we would see something like, let's see here. So you could just do queen check, or actually bishop check. He goes there. He could bring the bishop in. And then actually it looks like with rook to e5, this rook's going to come in. And if the bishop moves out of the way, the queen would have to sack. Otherwise, it would be a mate in two. All right, so let's finish out this game here. So takes, and now the last mistake was queen to c7. Check, check. And just look at this. He sacrificed a whole rook, basically, and a pawn, or a whole rook minus a pawn, and he's going to be mating in 4. Check. That was the last move at move 40. And now what happens is the queen comes here, he checks. If he goes here, then it's actually checkmate because the bishop is covering the g6 square. A very beautiful game, somewhat imperfect, but I really love these kind of games because they're very realistic. And I just love how, we're not playing computers here. And sometimes if you present enough problems and enough simple threats to your opponent, then you may be able to win. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed this game. I know I didn't cover every pertinent line in this game. Maybe I'll do it again, but I just wanted to get this video out there, and I really love the lessons from it. So leave a comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the future.